Okay, so let's begin. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We are delighted to welcome our guest, Angharad Stevens, here today at Loughborough Nationalism Network, also known as LUNN. Angharad has been very active in her work, which I will try to cover in this very short introduction. Angharad is a senior lecturer in geography at Swansea University. Her research focuses on developing critical approaches to knowledge and understanding of nationalism. This includes understanding the way politics become anchored around the nation state under modernity and engaging alternative historical and cultural understandings of politics, subjectivity, and citizenship. She has published across the fields of geography as well as politics and international relations in journals including Environment and Planning, Society and Space, International Political Sociology, Cultural Geographies, Emotion, Space and Society, and Geohumanities. She was also an assistant editor of the journal Citizenship Studies. In 2013, she published her first single-authored book, The Persistence of Nationalism. In 2017, she won the Peer Review Prize for Excellence of the International Political Sociology Journal. She's now working on a number of projects engaging the role of affect, emotion, and the senses in enabling and legitimizing ideas about national identity. And this is not a full list of her accomplishments. Today, Dr. Angharad is presenting her book titled National Affects, the Everyday Atmospheres of Being Political. I am sure we're all excited to hear more about it, but before we proceed, may I just say that we will have some time for Q&A at the end, but you're also very welcome to use the chat function, and I will make sure that your questions are addressed in the discussion. This meeting is recorded, so please close your cameras during the presentation and afterwards if you don't want to be on the recording. And with no further ado, I will pass the floor, virtual floor, to Angharad.
Thank you very much, Brigitte. Thank you, Marco, for the invitation to talk to LUNN, which sounds like a really important and exciting network. I've just closed the window because I could hear people out mowing the lawn outside. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, thank you for making all the arrangements. And as you said, I want to present today some parts of my forthcoming book titled National Affects. It will be published by Bloomsbury, IB Taurus on 8th September this year. In preparing for today, I felt I had two challenges. I asked myself, well, what can I contribute to this network, which must be at the forefront of thinking about the everydayness of nationalism, its everyday qualities. And the second challenge was, how will I say something new about this book, which rather than just talk through arguments that are finished and sealed up. So I've tried to take on both those challenges. Firstly, I want to try and defend the claim that an affective approach or drawing on affect theory really does add something interesting to the literatures and debates on everyday nationalism. And throughout the presentation, I'll try to return to this question of exactly how. In order to do that, I'm going to focus on the particular challenges of trying to respond to this context of heightened nationalism that we're living through in global politics at the moment and in the era of populism. So I say some things about that in the book, but this is an ongoing question for me. I know others are writing about the relationship between populism and nationalism and forms of knowledge or forms of doing, critique. I'm interested in those debates and I want to try and think through them further with you today. So let me share my screen so that we have the slides. Brigitte, can you see them? Can you see that okay? Yes? Okay, great. Okay. Central question of the book. How do ideas about us and them take form in ordinary spaces in ways that are both deeply felt and yet hardly noticeable? This is the organizing question of the book that the question that I keep returning to. And to address it today, I'm going to organize the talk in 4 sections that will roughly take about 7 to 10 minutes each, I hope, so that we finish in around 35 to 40 minutes time. Firstly, I want to take on this question of the relationship between nationalism and affect. Secondly, how I have turned to artistic practices as a way into thinking about being together outside of the frameworks of nationalism. Third, I want to go into more detail about that by drawing some material from one chapter in the book that discusses a performance piece called Neither Here Nor There by artists Joe Fong and Sonia Hughes. I'm really grateful to them for the opportunity to follow them around and learn from their work. And fourth, I'll come back to this question of the relationship between nationalism, populism, and affect theory, and what thinking affectively might offer us in responding to the current times and thinking about how to bring about change in particular. So to begin with, this claim about the return of nationalism. Now, since the election of Donald Trump as President of the United States in 2016, the Brexit vote, the election of Bolsonaro as President of Brazil in 2018, the rise of Narendra Modi's Indian People Party as but some examples, it has been claimed that nationalism has returned to global politics. Now, of course, for this audience, all theorists of nations and nationalism, I would imagine that most of us are unlikely to argue that nationalism has gone away anywhere, only to return. As Sinisa Malisevic usefully puts it, nationalism has been and remains the dominant mode of political legitimacy and collective subjectivity in the modern era. It's the dominant way in which we think about being a legitimate political subject. Nevertheless, there has been an intensification in the tone, language, gestures, policies used by political leaders to establish their authority, what can be said in public spaces as well as in intimate spaces. There's been a resurgence in talk about the people, harsher efforts to stop people crossing borders, the creation of new borders, the rise of overt racisms, as well as white nationalist and supremacist violence, as we have seen this week. And of course, a new war in Europe based, at least in part, on a conflict in ideas about the relationship between identity and territory. Now, I'm not trying to equate all of these moments or make sweeping generalizations about them. Surely any effort to study the nation teaches us that context matters, not least for how the nation can be both a tool of liberation and domination. However, the claim that I put forward in the book and that I want to defend today is that it's important to understand the nation's affective force if we want to understand how it endures and returns and persists in global politics. So all of the main theorists of nations and nationalism, from Ernest Gellner to Benedict Anderson to Anthony Smith, Partha Chatterjee, Homi Bhabha, they all point to the nation's capacity to to make us feel that we belong and claim that this is an important element of the nation, but this is never made the central focus of the study, I claim. However, I want to try and understand the nation as a structure of feeling, to borrow Raymond Williams's term. So that's my first point then, when we're asking why affect, that it helps us understand how nationalism endures. And in unpacking a little bit more of what I mean by affect, I refer here to Sarah Ahmed, who draws our attention to the affective forces that are precisely about the ways in which we connect to other bodies, the ways in which we feel moved by the proximity of others, is how she puts it. I'm also influenced by Teresa Brennan's book, The Transmission of Affect, Eve Sedgwick's work, Touching Feeling. But here I've just prioritized Hassan Hage's work, actually, in his more recent book, where he talks about the everyday processes of nation building and says, you know, we have to understand nationalism alongside all the ways, he says, in which we go about trying to make ourselves visible and comfortable in the world. He calls this a process of domestication. He says it applies to how we relate to others, but also how we relate to animals, insects, plants, trees, the world around us. What I like about his point is that he shows us that this is about much more than attending to individual emotions or the inner lives of social beings. What I want to highlight here is that this is about addressing the ways we live in common. Now, I come from a background in politics and international relations. What I love most about studies of nations and nationalism is that it's always an interdisciplinary field. And so my final point here is that I also situate nationalism in relation to a geopolitical cartography. Key authors I highlight here include Michael Shapiro, Keela Membe, Judith Butler's work. How these ideas about us and them are related to the state system, the histories of modernity, and so on. In that final quote, also a final point on the slide here, I also talk about wanting to approach the nation as a lively and mobile category. So to respond to that, to pick up on my point about, you know, what this offers the literatures on everyday nationalism, it's this that I've been motivated by, really, how to bring a mobile sense of the nation. I think it's often the case that we talk about the nation as a settled category. And what I appreciated about an affective approach was that it enabled me to consider how the nation comes in and out of focus, emerges and then retreats, grows louder and quieter in different sites and spaces. It's not always the same or all-encompassing, but mobile and changing. Okay, so what do I mean by national affects to complete this first section? I describe a national affect as an effort to orchestrate unity. And throughout the book, I focus on different times of crises or major events. So these range from the London 2012 Olympic Games to Brexit, the 2015 refugee crisis. I have a chapter on the funeral of Margaret Thatcher. Very different case studies. But in all of them, I felt that an attempt to orchestrate a sense of unity was underway. However, drawing on Ben Anderson and Helen Wilson's paper in the issue of environment and planning C that Marco and Michael Skay put together on affective nationalism. So drawing on their essay in that collection, they say that affects cannot just be straightforwardly connected to one spatial formation, such as the nation. They're ambivalent, ambiguous, not always coherent. So I'm also interested in how an event might involve efforts at securing unity, but will also involve other affects, and there will be other solidarities, gatherings, and forms of being together that are going on. So I'm not just interested in maybe the top-down orchestration of a national community, but also how other forms of communities bubble underneath those or alongside those kinds of moments. So I'm going to move on now to talk a little bit about methods and approach. I'm happy to come back to these opening points in questions later if we wish to, but I'm turning to this because in this book, but beyond this book, I think in terms of what affect offers us in the study of nations and nationalism, I find that this is not only an object of analysis, something that we can study or look at in the world, but also suggests different ways in which we might do the research, the methods that we use, also the styles of writing that we might adopt. So first of all, what I haven't put in the slide, but is a really important point that's in the introduction of the book and of interest to us as students of nations and nationalism, is affect theory presents a really exciting response to the problem of methodological nationalism, because it is interested not in individuals as distinct and separate beings, or in groups as distinct separate entities, but precisely in what happens in between these categories, or how do we come to think of people as distinct or of groups as distinct in the first place. So that is important methodologically. It's also important politically, writing against the backdrop of populism, where there's so much talk about different groups of people, the citizens and the foreigners, the people from here and the people from there, different modes of us and them. And indeed, quite coincidentally, I had started this work on thinking about affect long before events such as Brexit, but as that context in the UK intensified, but again, as things have intensified worldwide, I found myself looking for ways of writing about politics that could somehow get away from the noise and the certainties around us. The international relations theorist Jenny Edkins, as well as the sociologist Les Back, described that we're living in times of certainty. And in the way I wanted to work with affect, I was looking for something that was going to be less certain about its positions and viewpoints in the world, and more interested in ambivalence and introducing doubt. Excitingly also, I felt that affect suggested that politics involves more than an idea or decision or choice. And I wrote about this a little bit in the paper called Feeling Brexit. But again, I feel there's stuff I didn't manage to quite develop in that paper that I would like to develop further. In that, I was interested in how affect allowed us to think about power as not all-encompassing in its grip on people, so that it becomes difficult to ever imagine shifting or loosening or changing a situation. And here, you know, I've been inspired by the work of Michel Foucault, and also Eve Sedgwick, where she asks, what might a critical theory do beyond trying to expose a situation or reveal people's assumptions or their identities? This question that Sedgwick asked really stayed with me, of what kind of work might we do? And the reason that question was echoed with me so much at the time was because in the aftermath of Brexit, this is a very UK-centric mindset that I have now. You know, bear with me. There was a general sense of people being blamed for having the wrong view or a different view. So not only did it feel like that we were living in a country of two sides, that writers such as David Goodhart characterized as people from somewhere and people from nowhere or anywhere. So not only did we have that strong sense of groups, but we also had this idea that some people had been duped by power. So I was looking for ways of trying to understand power as not as something other than, you know, people being duped. And in this, a friend referred me to Stuart Hall's essay from 40 years ago, The Great Moving Right Show. And I reread that and noted how he said in 1979, when writing about the rise of Thatcherism in the UK, that Thatcherism's success did not only lie with the political and economic set of policies that it presented to people and its profound restructuring of the state. Its success had to be understood, Stuart Hall argued, for the way in which it was also an affective force. So people found comfort in these ideas or felt that it made sense for how they wanted to feel their place in the world. And I think we can make similar claims in relation to Boris Johnson's success today, or other populist parties, whether we like it or not. There is something about an affective claim that appeals to people. It's not just about policies. So all in all, this work on affect, I felt, was inviting me to think through these different points, and mostly also to think about how we think about our place in the world, how we assemble with others, how we form political communities. Now, there's a lot more I have in this section, but I know I've already taken a lot of time. I'll just gesture to how in the book I've experimented, therefore, with a different style of writing, which includes chapters, but also interludes that are stories of an encounter that I had with the world, and where I've tried to foreground experience as a way of trying to traverse between the intimate lives and global politics. None of this is new. This is stuff that feminist theorists have been experimenting with for several decades. It's also stuff that Black feminists have questioned, you know, what it means to foreground experience, whose experiences get heard. So there are significant critiques of trying to write experience into global politics as well. However, I felt that it enabled me to stay focused on this question of how the nation comes into view in particular times and spaces, and what effects it has. I wrote up one of those stories in that collection that I've just referred to of EPC that Michael Skay and Marco Antonsik put together. It's called A Hot Afternoon. Okay, I'm now going to move on to the artistic performance and work that I want to talk about and present today. So I raise it in one chapter in the book, and I feel it's a way of trying to unpack how we might think about living together in ways that avoid some of the frameworks of nationalism. So this work, Neither Here Nor There, was created by Jo Fong and Sonia Hughes. Again, I give my sincere thanks to them for putting up with me, following them around and listening in on their work since 2017. So firstly, I followed a project of Jo Fong's in Cardiff called Ways of Being Together, obviously of interest to me. Which she developed against the backdrop of Brexit as well as the Me Too movement. But this work, Neither Here Nor There, opened in Cardiff and ran at the Edinburgh Fringe Festival in 2019. I saw it once in Cardiff, once in Furnais in Mid Wales, where I carried out an interview with them both. It's still touring, and it was at the Gateshead International Festival of Theatre very recently. At the end of this presentation, I've linked to Sonia and Jo's current projects. Now, in other work that I had been following and that I've referred to already, I looked at a project by Volcano Theatre called The Populars, and wrote about how this presented some ways out of heavy ideas about groups that were in the atmosphere at the time. And I wrote about thinking with dance and movement as ways of, again, putting some of those identity categories in motion. Now, in both Neither Here Nor There and in Jo Fong's project Ways of Being Together, what appealed to me was that none of these works started from a sense of a shared identity or a stable ground. Rather, in inviting people to come together, they also suggested something of a risk, so that we all understood that we would meet people that we had never met before, and that we would all consider what it would mean to cultivate, rehearse and practice forms of togetherness in space. So I arrived at the performance in Capel y Graig, Furnais, Mid Wales, late afternoon in July 2019. This is a small village just 12 miles north from Aberystwyth, Wales, where I grew up. Also the site of the only Welsh UNESCO Biosphere Reserve, where salt marshes, wet grasslands provide a home for lapwings, redshanks, grasshopper, hopper warblers, dragonflies, ospreys and red kites. And in this chapel, it has been converted into an art space by Avi Allen, who is curator and custodian of the building. So I arrived along with the audience to this space of clean wooden floors, high ceilings, and a pared back design that allows for a very simple meditative space. We went in and took our seats at the various small tables and few pews laid out. And on the little tables, there were cards laid out that read small talk. Now, the audience knew the pretext of this performance. It had been advertised as an invitation to join in conversations with others, hosted by Jo and Sonia. So as we sat at the makeshift tables and took our turns, we were invited to either speak or to listen to the person sat with us in response to a series of questions printed out on these small white cards. We had 6 minutes to talk or to be quiet as we listened to someone else. Now, these small white cards echo a Fluxus piece by George Brecht, who post-Second World War printed event scores on small white cards with instructions and gave them to participants. Excuse me. They also drew on Fong and Hughes's experience of working with Quarantine Theatre Group based in Manchester, where for this theatre group, everyday life often forms a focus for the work. So in the short conversations, Joe and Sonia would take turns to speak. Sonia talked in this performance about accidentally finding out through Facebook that her neighbour had liked the far-right group Britain First. She talked about caring for her father, who has Alzheimer's, her effort to keep him in his own home, the costs of social care. She also spoke about a good year's work, a nice holiday, a wedding. Everyday racism was here presented as intertwined with the strains and pleasures of everyday life. As you can see from the questions, one question reproduced here, and I'll come to others. They were inviting us to tell a different story to the one that we're used to telling about ourselves. So, where is your dad from? Was informed by Sonia and Joe's own conversations about relationships with their fathers, and it was deliberately not, where do you come from? The racialized question that's familiar to many. So another question they proposed was, how does where you live inform how you live? The performance brought people together, but not to a degree that ever got too comfortable. The chairs remained wooden. They insisted that we were not going to be offered cake. This was not a therapy session. However, it engaged the question of what it means to listen to others. And I've developed this account of listening using some of Leah Basil's work on the politics of listening, as a form that acknowledges inequality and difference and the impossibility of complete understanding. I've also developed the kind of account of listening that I felt was going on using the work of anthropologist Charles Hirschkind and his study of cassette sermons in Cairo, part of the background sounds of many Middle Eastern cities. This interested me because Hirschkind develops an account of what he calls listening with attention. So as this next slide outlines, he talks about listening as an affective and a kinesthetic experience. And in his fieldwork accounts of talking to taxi drivers and other workers in Cairo and how they fit listening to sermons on cassettes into their everyday life, he describes how they never listened in an exact or a rigorous manner, or when one of his participants, Ahmad, lit up a cigarette as he listened to a sermon at the end of his working day, and Hirschkind asks him, well, is smoking compatible with serious listening? Ahmad just laughs, and Hirschkind later comes to realize or to claim that this distinction that we have in Eurocentric accounts of knowledge between serious listening and unserious or just hearing does not make sense for this kind of experience. It combines gravity and the hum of background noise. It is both. So listening in Hirschkind's account is more about a bodily method of attuning or learning to pay attention. It's not about listening harder, if anything. It's achieved by greater relaxation. And interestingly for me, thinking about this performance as well, this form of listening is not coded with any moral or ethical principles. So it sidesteps ideas about good listening or not listening hard enough. Now, I felt that this was useful in helping me think through the achievements of this performance, which also refused to lay out a particular moral code for us as an audience of what we were meant to do with all this listening. To put it another way, this performance intervened in the present, but it didn't seek to impose meaning on it. Now, in the final section, having outlined some of the key tenets of this work, I want to bring the discussion back to what this performance might be telling us and what we might take from it in terms of thinking through intervening and responding politically in a context of heightened nationalism and populism. So here I want to say something about thinking about change and an atmospheric register. Now, the political theorist William Walters and Barbara Luthi have described what it feels like to live among the cramped spaces of intensified nationalism, a concept that really resonated to me in terms of trying to explain how nationalism at certain points makes certain things unsayable or makes particular forms of critique more difficult to make. It's because that sense that we live momentarily and obviously to different degrees in different contexts. I can't emphasize that enough, how this context makes all the difference of what a cramped space might mean. In response to that, nevertheless, this performance articulated a politics that worked with ambivalence. So as geographer Liz Bondi puts it in an article on feminist geography, this means creating spaces in which tensions, contradictions, and paradoxes can be negotiated fruitfully and dynamically, and not shut down or avoided. So this performance situated itself in the middle of things, in the middle of all these tensions and contradictions. And recalling Hirschkin's work again, participating was not equated with a form of practicing good citizenship. Rather, there was no strict distinction here between ethics and entertainment. Mostly, the possibility of change is here disconnected from narratives of redemption, a clear sense of purpose or direction, and is disconnected from a sense of group identity or ideas about transformation of the status quo. And all of these ideas, I think, share in the logics of nationalism. That's something that I unpacked more in my first book. Through this performance, what we can consider instead are the possibilities for thinking about change as a shift in atmosphere. And I feel this is directly relevant for addressing situations of heightened nationalism, where we might find ourselves surrounded by heavy ideas about us and them, one side versus the other side, to consider how in different moments we can sometimes set these frameworks in motion. And here I turn to Lisa Paulson-Gallal and Kirsten Havengard Larsen's work. because whose work I came across because they wrote about organised interfaith walks, and how these walks that are meant to, of course, generate possibilities for identification and recognition through walking and bringing about a good atmosphere. Whilst not dismissing that work, they were much more interested in the transformative potential of the affective register on these walks, where they say there cannot be a promise of change, but there is a possibility of partly loosening the grip of the frozen status quo. So it's at this kind of register that this performance is operating. And it's this register that I find a hopeful register for thinking about how to intervene in a context of populism and heightened nationalism. Now, of course, there is a significant, well-established critique against this kind of argument that I'm developing. So Jodie Dean, the political theorist, for example, dismisses the idea of what she calls an aesthetic micropolitics, saying this cannot amount to a serious form of resistance, or it is insufficient as a form of resistance. But throughout the book, this is exactly what I do try to unpack. So, for instance, I draw on Lauren Bellant's phrase of modes of acting politically that take place under the radar of a formal politics, or modes of acting that are informed by images of bodies involved in caring work, which is a very different image to the autonomous actor that can stand up or strive. So these are different images that I work with in different chapters, but they're all concerned with trying to think about resistance in different ways. Now, of course, the arts are never a model for political action. Most artistic works, including this one that I've addressed today, would not present itself as an explicitly political intervention. That's not its intention. However, the aesthetic register is, of course, inseparable from the political. As I discussed earlier, some artistic works reflect subjects, characters and groups back to us, but other ones are interested in how they might use sensations, affects and intensities for changing the arrangement of subjects, characters and groups. These are the kinds of artistic works I'm interested in following around. So any serious engagement with the politics of change, I want to claim, has to engage this register of people's affective inclinations, habits, experiences, the kind of register that I think Stuart Hall was referring to, the register that I think Hassan Hage is talking about too, how people make themselves comfortable in the world. This is what I feel a critical politics has to take on. And this approach refuses to wait for people to arrive at a better or an improved moral position. It refuses to wait for one set of people to change their minds or become more educated. Rather, this register can reveal how we're all compromised and we all have our blind spots. It starts from where we are and what can be done to shift a situation, to move past a blockage or make things marginally better. So yes, it's something, but it is also not enough. Now, to conclude, I want to connect this effort that Fong and Hughes were engaged with Judith Butler's work in her performative theory of assembly. So I want to just conclude, I've taken a lot of your time, I appreciate your patience very much, that what's going on in this work and why it is of interest to us as students of nations and nationalism is that they're working on the question of what will be the conditions necessary for people to assemble with others and perhaps to deliver a set of political demands. And as Butler puts it, showing up, standing, breathing, moving, standing still, speech, silence, they're all aspects of an assembly, an unforeseen form of political performativity that puts life at the forefront of politics. And this sort of gathering work happens before any group lays out its demands or begins to explain itself in proper political speech. So it precedes, working out or making sense of one's demands. So to conclude, or to end, what we might need to relearn here, and I think what we can learn through this work, as well as the literatures that I've referred to, is how to assemble again with others.
Thank you very much, Angharad. Very interesting and very insightful talk. I definitely do have some questions, but maybe let's start with questions from the audience. So if you want to ask a question, just raise a hand. And I see one hand from Marco. So Marco.
Angharad, thank you very much. Insightful as always. And obviously, I come from a critical perspective, as you could imagine. So I do appreciate and I do share the importance of affect as a way of studying nation. You use affect as a way of telling us that affect allow us to capture the persistence of the nation. Like in a sense, Billy was saying, the banality is what allows to see that the nation is so persistent. But at the same time, throughout your own project, you don't develop there. You move away. So you don't use affect as a way of refining our knowledge of the everyday that you mentioned at the beginning, but you move away. And I think you move away because you assume that the nation is structurally associated with the register of discrimination, dispossession, marginalization, etc. But in this very movement of moving away from the nation, in a sense, you reconfirm what you want to fight. So this heightened nationalism. So you leave the nation in the hands of the nationalists, whereas the nation can equally be a register of contradiction, ambivalence, tensions, exactly like any other forms of coming together. So the question is, why don't you push even further and then use that affect to maybe show these all tensions, contradiction, they also exist in the nation, and how the nation actually always come together in a different ways, not just in the way that the nationalists present and is so dominant also in the media. Thanks.
Thank you, Marco. I've written that down. So if you want to take more questions, I may be able to answer, or I'll try and answer things together.
Yeah.
I'm aware I spoke for too long. I'm sorry.
Okay, it was very interesting, so we didn't want to stop you. Do we have any other questions from the audience? You can also use the chat function. I have a question, so while people are thinking, I could maybe use the opportunity to ask. So one of my questions was kind of related to Marco, so that the nation is very often approached from this sort of monolithic understanding, which is a legacy of nationalism studies, but also memory studies, which I'm interested in. But I see your approach in some ways as as a way to challenge this monolithic thinking. And my question was whether you thought the same, and how you were positioning your work in relation to this these sort of classic approaches. My other question was, in your work, language seems to take a very important part. It is part of your method in a way, in understanding affect. But you also extend your analysis to listening, which I think is a shift towards these bodily experiences of the nation, which almost naturally makes me think about the sort of performance, which you mentioned as well, performance of the nation. And Butler spoke about performance of gender. And I'm wondering whether you look at intersection of both. So performing nation, but performing gender as well at the same time. And that would also maybe be a way of looking at not only top down, but also bottom up practices. And another hand, or do you want to answer these and then we move to others?
No, I'm happy to hear more, because I'll only be able to try to answer anyway. This is going to take me months to think through the proper answer.
Okay, we have a hand from Afzal. Afzal, if you want to unmute yourself.
Hello, Angharad. That was fantastic. Thank you very much. Really found it interesting. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on how popular culture affects popular nationalism. You mentioned very briefly Trump and of course Thatcher. And I just wondered whether you have noticed the impact of, say, Hollywood on how politics and international relations is viewed as a consequence of the messages that come out of popular films and TV shows. I don't know whether that is an area you looked at. I'd be very interested in anything you have to say on
that. Okay, well, thank you for great questions, and I will take them away with me and they will really help my thinking. Thank you very much. Thanks for everyone's patience with me as well. I really enjoyed those comments, Marco, and the current times that we're living in will demand that people sometimes have to take uncomfortable positions, or critical theorists taking up positions that they might not expect to do because they might not be a purely political place to stand, if that makes sense. So whereas it wouldn't be my project to re-articulate the nation into a more inclusive civic space, that's not the kind of key work that I'm doing. That work is absolutely central and important at the same time, and it's more important than ever. So if I think that through, just UK politics and its capture at the moment by authoritarianism and a very right-wing nationalism, there have to be alternatives to that available for people, and we know it's not working from the way it is. The regions and nations are articulating their own national identity in response to it. Now, what I'm interested in doing is asking, how can we think about being political in other terms outside of these national frameworks? That is what I'm interested in doing. But that's not to discount the important work of also having a civic national language available for people. I'm glad that you think, Brigitta, that there's potential here for challenging some of the monolithic thinking in studies of nations and nationalism. And I think there's great potential for thinking through memory studies in a slightly different way, perhaps in refreshing ways. That's not something I've thought through. The language issue, I did write a short piece on affects and language for citizenship studies last year, trying to think about why did hearing other languages wind people up so much. So that started from a comments by the former leader of the UK Independence Party about not hearing English on the train. And that just got me thinking about what is it about another language and this kind of affective impact of that on people, how not hearing English was invited a visceral bodily response in him. And thank you for drawing links between the nation and gender. I think that's where all my thinking started on this, by connecting questions of gender and nation. And Afzal, if I may, thank you for bringing me back to popular culture. So in the full chapter on this, I start with the connections between dance and the nation, which Elizabeth Millets has written so much about. And of course, I had to think about a show such as Strictly Come Dancing, so much questions that it presents for the study of nations and nationalism, from the continued force of linear television and the idea that we're sharing in a common community with others by joining in watching something at the same time or on the same day. And read through a representational frame, we can talk about, we can critique that show for its whiteness, for reproducing the heterosexual couple. But also on that show, we've seen the emergence of really important Black female figures, as well as a same-sex partner in this year's show. So I haven't developed this work, but it did make me think about how what popular culture does is never static. Again, it's never just the processes of inclusion or exclusion, but how the frames can shift through a show, how things can interrupt. Things coming up in a show can interrupt the familiar frameworks and present something that was unexpected, not even designed by the show's creators, or not even, things that emerge that were beyond the planning or manipulation of affects. So that's all I have to say on that. And I'm aware we've taken an hour now.
Yeah. We're perfect with time. So if there are, we see a comment in the chat. The British have tended to see language as a source of threat, hence the banning of Welsh, etc. in the past. Not surprising that people find different language in the UK a threat to national identity rather than an enrichment of it.
Yes, I'm conscious of that. But it has also been, co-opted into a multicultural frame, such as the singing in Welsh at the Jubilee concert on Sunday night. So other languages spoken in the UK get co-opted and excluded in at different times and spaces. Someone's got to write about all these Jubilee events taking place this summer. I look forward to seeing that paper. So someone has to write.
Yes, definitely. Okay, so if we don't have any more questions, I just really want to thank Angharad for this opportunity to hear from you about your book, but also thank you very much to all our participants. Thank you for your questions. Look out for Angharad's book, which comes out 11th of August. Is that right?
In September. But thank you so much for the opportunity to share some material from it. Thank you.
Yes, and I hope to see everyone in the future events of LUNN. Thank you.
Bye now. Bye.